to class 12 like stuff. But
So hey guys, I can see 4 of you are online, 5 of you are online already. So I'll start with the basic introduction of myself and how I got to do what I want to do right now. So I'm Abhilesh Thavanjar. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I work with evolutionary genetics. So it's basically knowing how different species coming to being, and so why is there so much diversity in the world, and essentially what happens when different populations intermix, and how does like the life on Earth itself evolve. So that's like the primary broad goal of like our studies. And to give a some background about how I got here, essentially for to be so PhD is like a step that's an obligatory step in the training towards becoming a scientist. So like if you want to become a scientist or a professor, a university professor is like the best job you can get. And so towards that, like PhD is one of the stepping stones that you have to go through. The first step would be just having a basic science background. So when you're in your like junior college, like 11th and 12th grade, you basically start with your having all your basic sciences. So people choose to go PCB or PCM depending on what their interests align, if they like maths or not. I chose PCMB, so I went with all of those because I was just interested in everything. And so once you have that sort of a base in basic sciences, then you can go for a bachelor's and a master's in basic sciences. If you want to do a PhD in the US, a master's is not needed. You can just like start after your bachelor's. The bachelor's is about a course like that's 4 years, and depending on what specializations you want, you can have different courseworks and different structures. And master's is more of a research oriented degree wherein like you have to produce some sort of original work. So bachelor's is more coursework. You get to learn about the subjects a lot. You get to know like it's mostly information based, whereas like masters is like more research based. So you are basically doing your own research projects and generating new knowledge. So I completed my bachelor's and master's in 2015 from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Pune. That's ISA Pune, and it was a great place to be at. And it afforded us opportunities to basically dive into research straight from the start. So like it was a 5-year integrated BSMS degree that they offer, and we could start doing research projects straight from the first year itself. So like you start learning about science by doing science, and that was what kind of like reinforced my interest in science and led me to believe that I want to be a scientist, and that's kind of like shaping my future career pathways. Um, so about like the eligibility criteria, ISAs are sort of so they are kind of the counterparts of IITs in engineering. So what IITs are for engineering, ISAs are for science, and so that's why they sort of tend to have a lot of high eligibility criteria. Back when I applied in 2010, there were 3 different streams you can apply from. So one of them was you either get a ranking in IITJ, and based on your ranking, they would go through the normal counseling process and like assign you an ISA. The second one was through KVPY. So the Department of Science and Technology in India has this scholarship scheme called the Kishore Vigyanik Protsahan Yojana, KVPY. And so it's a two-step process. So you could either do it after 10th or after 12th. And what they do is like the criteria for those 2 levels are a little bit different, but then essentially it's a bunch of like interviews. So there's a written exam first. You have to clear the written exam. It's like a national level exam. So there's a lot of applicants. I think the top 5% or top 2% are the ones that get called on for interviews. And so once you, then there's a panel of esteemed scientists involved that come and ask you about your goals and like your background knowledge about how much you know in sciences. And so it's kind of like a personal interview wherein the panel is like 5 scientists from all sorts of fields. They could be mathematicians, they could be chemists, they could be biologists, and they're just testing your general background knowledge in biology. So once you get into KVPY, you get a scholarship to study science, and like basically they'd give you about 5,000, 7,000 a month, depending on wherever you choose to do a bachelor's. So it has to be a bachelor's in science and not engineering per se. So it has to be a degree in science, and that's when you're eligible for the scholarship. So that was a stream 2, and the stream 3 was through the boards. So like if you just have very good marks in your 12th board exams, then that also was considered as a eligibility criteria. So that was the third stream. Back in 2010, they had they used cutoffs for the top 1%. So like depending on the board you studied from, it could be Maharashtra board, it could be your state board, it could be CBSE, ICSE. They basically have a eligibility criteria for all of those. And so the top 1% of all scoring candidates for that particular year are considered. That determines the cutoff. And so when I did it in 2010, it was they had cutoffs for both the 10th board and the 12th board. So you had to be in the top 1% in both those exams. And then once you get that, once you clear that cutoff criteria, then they ask you to come in for a written exam that's specific to the ISAs. And so it's mostly PCMB. So you have to have some sort of biological knowledge too. If you drop biology, it's a little bit of a disadvantage, but then not too much, because you can score on the other sections. But it's all the 4 subjects. And then once that's done, then they assign you with, depending on your scores, it's a nationalized, centralized process, and they assign you a particular ISA depending on the vacancies and how things work out. So those are the 3 things, 3 streams that basically that's how you can get into ISA. And like ISAs, back when I joined in, were the premier institutes for doing science in India. Like they had a lot of funding, they had the best teachers, the best scientists in the world teaching you how to do science, and they had the best equipment. And just the course structure was like very hands-on. So like you could just like start doing science as you're starting to learn about science. So that was the one good thing about ISA. And like if you are interested in science, I would highly recommend just joining or applying for those, and hopefully you get in. And college life in ISA. So ISAs were relatively new. They started the whole ISA thing in 2006, and so I joined in as the fifth batch of ISA. And so because it was a relatively new institute, there wasn't much, like it wasn't an established thing. So when I showed up to ISA, it was just like we had one building, so we didn't even have a campus as like people would imagine. Like you have a sprawling campus with like multiple recreational facilities and like all those kind of things. We didn't really have that sort of stuff. We just had one building, and that one building was like our home for 2 years, I guess. So the hostel, the mess, the classrooms were all in that. But what they made up in lack of infrastructure was like the scientific equipment and everything else was pretty good. So like even though you didn't have the campus, ISA Pune was located in the city, so it was very close to the city centers, and like you could have a basic city life without having to rely too much on like what the campus has to offer you. And so overall, ISAs now have a lot of infrastructure that's like way better than what we had when we were studying. And now like ISA Pune has its own big cricket field and like indoor badminton complexes and all this sort of stuff that like help you focus on the other things in life that you might want to do apart from science. And so as far as the skills goes, like so basic science is essentially what it refers to is like you just go out, you see something, like there's some phenomena you're interested about, right? So like suppose you see the splitting of light, and you see like white light getting split into multiple its components, and like you see all those colors, you see a rainbow somewhere, and like that kind of sparks a question like why does that happen, how does it happen? And like it's those questions that like we seek to answer as basic scientists or like pure science in say. So there's not a applied science component to it. It's basically like it's not like, oh, I want to make this. It's more like I want to understand how this works, and then once we have a better understanding of how the world works around us, then we can like apply those to make life better. So for example, like the reason we are talking right now, and the way we can talk right now, the thing that makes it possible like across the globe is basically basic principles of quantum mechanics and how it led to the solid state revolution. So it was like people were just interested in like how atoms interact and how they interact with light, and they started like developing theories as to like how they just like started developing a model of how the world would work. And essentially from that, then other people came on, took on that understanding, and they extended to practical real life applications. And that's how we have Wi-Fi and internet and all those sort of things, right? So basic sciences is when you start making discoveries, and it's like the first step towards any sort of like better understanding of the world. And so different fields of science do that differently. Biologists are mainly concerned with the life sciences. So for me, it's more about like how do diseases manifest themselves? How do diseases spread? How does your genetics affect the way you are, and how does it affect different your propensities to be susceptible to different diseases and all those sort of things. And like my basic research essentially deals with mitochondria. So you may have heard that the mitochondria is the power of the cell, and so that's like something that everyone learns in their science education, basic science education. Um, so it's like so once I started learning about mitochondria, like I came to know that these tiny things that like live inside all of your cells, and like all the organisms have it. All eukaryotic organisms that use oxygen to make energy have this small, tiny little organelle. And there's so much more to this one tiny thing than just being the power of the cell. And like essentially that's what led me to, but we don't know much about it. So that's what led me to like ask questions about like how does it interact with the other cells, and like how does mitochondria in humans work differently than say a monkey that lives in high altitudes like the Himalayas or something like that, right? So like what are those things, that what are the changes that led life live and adapt to different climatic regions and all those sort of things. So like as scientists, we're just basically inspired by questions like that. We just want to know how the world works, and we sort of chip in and try to solve it one step at a time. So that's how basic sciences work in a way. And as far as like some of the careers goes, like if you are really interested in science, like the dream job for you would be like being a university professor. So like you head a research group, so you have this like broad idea or like this broad like research interest that you want to work on. And so you essentially have to teach. So you teach at the undergrad level, so you're giving lectures, and it's always nice to interact with young people and know all those ideas. So it's like a very intellectually stimulating environment. The university also has you do your own research, so like you basically get money to do your research, and so most of the time you just thinking, writing grants, coming up with ideas, and so you get paid for thinking, which is amazing, right? And so that's part of it. And also you have to manage different people, train young trainees, interns, and like get their science started. And there's also like opportunities to go out and communicate science with the public. So you can go out in the museums and like people can talk and you can just like disseminate. So that's the one like primary goal that most people who enter basic sciences have in their mind. And that's what I also want to become, is like the university professor. So you can do research and training both at the same time. Other jobs are like a researcher in a industry. So like if you have a more applied interest in sciences, say you want to make a drug for something, or say you want to try to figure out how to like get DNA extractions working, or like how to extract DNA from different cells, or for example, like computer science is a primarily applied sciences field. So things like that. For that, you have an industry sector. So like if you're a computer scientist, like there's a lot of opportunities because of the whole Silicon Valley boom, and then the crazy AI thing that we're going through right now. And so there's a lot of jobs, and those are applied sciences tend to be more high paying than the basic sciences, but there are pros and cons to both, and I'll talk about those once I get to those. Apart from that, once having a basic science knowledge just helps you be more informed and make more informed decisions. So it like being a scientist, you're just honing your critical thinking skills throughout, and you just do that throughout your training. And so that just helps you with like once you're a scientist, like there's no set curriculum. Like a PhD is basically a research program, which is you get a problem, you think about a problem, and you try to come up with ways to solve it. And when you solve it, you get that degree. And so essentially, what happens is that you become very good at problem solving. So like even if you can just apply those sort of skills to any career you choose, like it just lets you identify the main problems and how to attack a complex seeming problem, and essentially how to make progress on those. So like being a scientist is like you develop a multitude of skills. It could be programming, it could be basic lab techniques, it could be organizational skills, like journalism, because you have to also like disseminate your science. So you have to make it accessible to the people who don't really have the expertise to understand all the jargon that goes in. And so there's a lot of skills that you develop over the course of like a scientific training career. As far as basic sciences goes, like life sciences, there's a whole range of spectrum as to how much you can earn being in the sciences. One common conception, which is not completely false, is that like sciences don't really it's not a money making career. So like you're not going to have a Lamborghini or something like that, right? Like so it's something that's like you get money, you get like millions of dollars, but that's for your research, and that's what we kind of want for like you get money to invest in all the fancy state-of-the-art equipment to like answer the bleeding edge questions, but you're not going to have a lot of personal wealth. That being said, the other opportunities that basic sciences afford is like essentially you get to go to conferences and talk to other scientists, and like talk about your research and talk about like research in general, with like meet interesting people at these conferences. And these conferences are held all around the world. And most of the times what you can do is like you can apply for scholarships, and they would basically cover all the cost of all the expenses of your trip. So like you get to go to exotic locations, talk about your research, and all of it is paid for. So if I like, that's probably one of my best things about it too. And just being in science, like your friends are also kind of like spread out across the globe. So you would like have a friend in every country you visit. So that kind of helps with the accommodation things. And so I can travel on cheap that way. So there are other perks to a life in science than just the money. And I feel like the curiosity or the or my interest in knowing how the world works kind of trumps my my goal of earning money. So it's a comfortable life. You're gonna have enough. I can save and travel around the world with with the stipend I get, but it's also not like a very high salary. So that's what basic sciences are like. It's more of like you have a comfortable life, but not a luxurious one. But if you're in the applied sciences, things are a little different. Like, so basically, then because your research can be applied for some sort of like a profit, you may or may not get parts of that profit. If you work for a big company, the company has vested interest in making money, so they kind of try to hire the best recruits and pay you more for that. It's a similar model to what startup industries have, and like what Silicon Valley is, right? Like you see all those crazy salaries, and that's if you want to make money and still want to do science, industry is a very good avenue for that. um, and yeah, so it tends to be more structured. Academia is more loose structure, and so there's not you get a lot of intellectual freedom, so you get to choose what projects you want to work on, how you tackle those projects, and like all those sort of things. When do you work? So I don't really have a set schedule of work, which is kind of a bane and a boon, which means that I can like take off whenever I want. I can I don't have to like give in a leave application and stuff like that. So those are just the practical aspects of it. But at the same time, it just means that like because I'm so interested in this work, I tend to spend most of my free time in the lab and just trying to get things working and all those sort of things. So it's a bane and a boon in pure science. So academia tends to be more unstructured and loose in terms of how like just the work life is. But if you go in the industry is like a typical 9 to 5 job. You go there, you're assigned a particular project, and that's what you work on. So those are two of the main like distinctions between pure science and applied sciences. And because it's like academia is primarily unstructured, like you don't really have the whole. It's different from other fields in the sense that like we don't really have placements at the end of our degrees. So like after BSMS, like there weren't any companies coming to um, coming to like recruit any potential employees. Things have changed since then. Like when I was in ISET, it was still in its early ages, and so like it was an experiment, so we didn't really know what we wanted to do. But then most of my cohort actually went into PhD, so it worked out very well for us. But if you I'm pretty sure now most ICERs have a placement cell, and like if you are interested in the industry aspects of science, you can they have avenues that will help you go into that and like get some resources for that. But typically, if you have a more applied specialization like pharmacology or say microbiology or something like that, like then you have the potential of having companies come for look seeking placements and stuff like that. But as far as academia goes, you basically fend stuff for yourself. So you identify the people you want to work with, you identify the questions you want to work with. So it's you're highly independent, and that independence is what academia sort of affords you. Um, Pros and cons of the respective field, as I've already said, like there's not a lot of money, but then it's a comfortable life, which means that like you have more than enough to save to do what you want, but then you're not going to have that Lamborghini, right? But then also, how many other jobs you have to be at the top of any field you pick to do that, and science is no exception. The one good thing is that the pros are like you're working on this one tiny bit, one tiny question, and you're kind of adding to the whole pool of human knowledge. And so like you spend years trying to understand this one tiny quirk, like why does it work, how does it work, what makes it click, and all those sort of things. And for a brief moment in time before you actually disseminate your results to the world, you're the only person in the world who knows that particular thing. And that kind of eureka feeling is what we crave. And it's like the moment it clicks, it all just falls into place. Like it's like solving a puzzle, right? It's kind of like a detective work. So like you have all these clues that are spread around, and then like you're trying to like form a common thread through it and like see where your answer might lie. And sometimes like it just takes years to get that sort of like vision, and like you chip at it, you keep chipping at it, and finally when you get that eureka moment is what like is exhilarating, it's thrilling, and that's what we crave. And that's why kind of like science is really exciting for me. So those are kind of like the background about what science is. And then if you have any particular questions that you want particular to your particular interest, I'd be happy to answer those. So I guess I have a question from Siddharth that he's a gap year applicant and really interested in getting a job in the field of robotics and computer science. Um, and the best way to get involved about it is so gap year. Um, are you done with your junior college and you're looking for a bachelor's or a master's, or do you already have a bachelor's or master's? Because gap years would be different depending on what level you are at. So for instance, if you already done a bachelor's or a master's, the best way to get into research would be just like look for research. It's called a research assistantship. So essentially, what people do is like once you have a lab, like you have ideas, but you also need someone to like kind of do the work um, and sort of like take the project and like take it to new heights, right? So what you do is like you have also have a lot of responsibilities as a scientist. So like most of the time what you do is like you set up a lab group, and the lab group focuses on different projects, and like so each student or a trainee gets assigned a project, and then like they work and they learn the skills as well as try to solve the problem that they were assigned at. And so the best way to get into research would be just like um, so first of all, identify what your interests are, like even robotics and computer science, what exactly, what subset of science you want to work in. It's important to know that distinction because like science motivations matter a lot. It's hard work, and so you could be in the lab at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then you want to know um, like you need to have a good reason why you're there, right? So like it's a lot, you need a lot of motivation. And so for that, just like keep experimenting with things, see what you like, what you don't like, and then sort of form your interest based on that. And once you have that, then try to identify people who've already have openings for research assistantships and stuff like that. And so what that will enable you is that like it'll be like a sort of internship wherein like you get assigned a project, and then you work on this project, and so you essentially start developing those skills that you need to make a career in that. And if you are a gap year applicant, it doesn't really matter as long as you have the necessary experience, and experience just comes through just joining a lab group and like working on different projects. Computer science is easier in the sense that like all you need is a computer and like some sort of and there's like a lot of resources online that you can start working on different projects and like start your own projects out of like from scratch, and like you have enough resources that you can like self learn. If you are in some other fields like physics, biology, wherein like you sort of need some specialized equipment to like even start asking basic questions, that's when looking for a research assistantship becomes more important. And it's just like identify the people and just get in contact directly. It's there's no centralized or a standard set of protocol for like going about how to get involved, but then it's mostly like you network. It's like you find someone you're interested in, you send them shoot them a mail, you basically tell them your interests, and then you kind of sort of work it out from there. So that would be my advice for just like how you get involved into any sort of research. um, all right, so we have another question from Rohan, who says he's interested in a career in pure mathematics and wants to go into research, and he wants to pursue a bachelor's from the top universities in the world, and what course of action he should pursue. So it depends by what you mean in the sense of top universities, and there are other practical considerations to make when you choose a university than just based on the topness. So one important thing in like, I mean, you guys are pretty sure about this. Like you guys already know this, right? Like it's like the importance of mentors is really important, and like having a good mentor could make or break your interest per se. And so like while universities kind of like give you the framework to form those connections with your mentors, it's really important to find a good mentor who would be willing to support you through your journey. And so when you're looking at top universities, like especially in the US, if you're going for a bachelor's, it's really hard to get some scholarships. If you get a scholarship, well and good. Otherwise, education can be really, really expensive. And at that point, like even because the currency exchange rate is pretty high with the Indian rupee, it's kind of like even living in the US kind of gets expensive if you're taking out loans and stuff like that. So that's a practical consideration for someone who's aiming to get into a top university in the US. That said, European universities are more focused. They're more like specialized. They also have relatively they're very cheap compared to the US universities, and they're also a good avenue if you want to get into if you want to get into, like, say, the European society in general. The one obstacle there would be just like, because European countries have their own languages, language barriers might be an issue just with living and like learning there. But it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I've lived in Germany, and it wasn't a big obstacle in like my learning experience. And so if you want to go into the US, like, so basically just identify where you want to go, and how you would identify that is look at their programs. And so at this stage, if you're getting into say the undergrad, it's very important to explore your possibilities and experiment. So like, just look for a university that offers you a well-rounded program. So like, don't get too hung up on one particular specialization. It's good to have that, you should have that, but at the same time be open to other things, and like would lead to your overall development. And it's really important to, as a scientist, to like know a lot about a lot of different fields, so that you can connect those dots and like form the bigger picture. So first identify what you want to get into, and then so looking for universities, look for a more well-rounded, broader program. At the same time, look for potential mentors you would want to work with, because if you're doing a bachelor's or a typical master's in the US, it's always good to have a research project. And so to get a research project, you need to work with someone, to work with an established scientist. So it's always nice to identify that. And once you have those things, then like once you have those narrowed down, then you can go into the logistical aspects of it, like how do you basically just like what exams do you need to give? So for the US, like at the undergrad level, you have the SAT, ACT. At the graduate level, you have the GRE and stuff like that. So each country and each university would have their own basic requirements, and you could do that sort of thing once you've identified where you want to be. All right, so on to the next question. I hope that answers that query. So Samarth Nagpal has a question about internships, and yeah, internships definitely help a lot. Internships afford you the opportunity to just like learn while doing it, and that's the best way to learn anything. Like, you could read so much, and you could watch so many videos, and you could talk to so many people, but until you do it, I don't think you have a very deep understanding or a clear understanding of what you're getting into. And so internships let you get that experience. And so you basically, when you're doing internship, you are frustrated with the problems like firsthand. So like, you know what it feels like to be a person in that particular field, right? So if you're doing an internship with a journalist, you know what the day-to-day life of a journalist is. Like, when people talk about their careers, they often paint this like bright picture as like, hey, this is the big picture and this is why they're interested in it. But then that might not always correlate with their day-to-day work. So as like as a biologist, people think I go on the field a lot, and like I'm this person who's out in the jungles most of the time observing animals. I used to do that, but not anymore. And like right now, most of my day-to-day work is at a computer analyzing data, or like just working with fruit flies. And so depending on like what particular fields they are, like the day-to-day experiences can be very different from what the general portrayal is. So that's why internships are really important, and like try to get your hands on most internships, on as many internships as you can, and like just be as broad as you can, as far as your interests allow you. And so if you are interested in genetic engineering, so yeah, as Indians, we do have this conundrum wherein like we sort of need to basically have a financially sound career option, right? So for most of us, that means being an engineer or like being a doctor. And so the choices are then restricted to like being what particular type of an engineer versus what particular type of doctor. But things have significantly changed, even though the cultural paradigm is not there yet. Like, we still have a lot more opportunities to pursue a lot more different careers. And so medical sciences are very intensive, and also very like they can be very tough if you're not interested in being a doctor and like the service aspects of the career. So in that case, it's always better to, like, right now, since you're in I'm talking to Samarth right now, and so Samarth, since you're in 10th class, you still have a lot of options open. And so at this point, just keep all your options open. Don't drop maths, because people would tell you that like you need to be more focused, and like PCB is the right way to go. But then if you want to just be a scientist, like we use, as a biologist, I use math every day, and like I need to develop new math just to like answer the questions I am answering in biology. So don't close any doors. Keep everything open. 10th standard is a very good place to start exploring different things. And so even if like the people around you say that like you should go for a medical career, listen to them. I mean, in a way, don't just go and like rebel against it. But then at the same time, like be mindful of what your interests are. So like if you want to be a genetics engineer, and the kind of like the skill set that you need for being a genetic engineer and a medical student are sort of the same. So like you don't have to actually go and rebel. You can just go with the flow, keeping your interest in mind. And like when the point comes to make that important distinction, whether you want to become the doctor or become a genetic engineer, that's when you put up the fight. So right now, I would just say keep your options open. If there's a lot of pressure from home or something like that, just go with the flow. And then finally, once you have a more clear understanding of what you want, why you want, that's when you take a stand. That's when you make a decision. So that's primarily like the basic advice. Once you clear your 12th exams, 12th board exams, then you can have a better sense of like what specialization you want to get into with the genetics thing, and like what particular skills you would want to hone on when you want to become a genetic engineer in a way. And talking about internships at the high school or like the junior college level, so I was fortunate in the sense that like I was always interested in science, like right from my middle school days, and like I was a very active participant in Olympiads and science quizzes. And what that enabled me to do was like find people, or like find basically teachers who were really interested in science, but then they also wanted the kids to like they wanted to inspire the kids to be scientists. And so essentially being in those sort of fields, like being in Olympiads, being in like the science quizzes, that exposed me to people who already were kind of open to give you those opportunities. And that's how you start making your own network. And like it teaches you the important skill of like communicating effectively, getting your interest, and getting your points across, and convincing people just like why you're worthy of investing in. That's like no matter what field you choose, and you have to do that. And so right now would be a good trying to get internships right now would be a good exercise for that too. So just try to go for any sort of like science focused event you can find off. Like there's a lot of like science competitions that want people to come up with like crazy science projects, and like science fairs and stuff like that. So like keep going to those. The judges there are a good resource. Talk to them about how they could get involved, because try to find someone local so that you can just like plug yourself in their program. And that's the advice I would give for internships at the high school level. And you'd be surprised at how excited people are to guide high school students, especially. You might think you don't know enough right now, and that's why there's this like there's worry about like not being able to like do a lot. But you'd be surprised at how many people are excited about working with high school students. So just like put yourself out there, reach out to people, be excited about the work, and I'm pretty sure you'll get a lot of positive feedback. So that's kind of the stuff. All right. So Samarth also has a question about what genetic engineering and evolutionary genetics works. And so assuming you have like the 10th grade knowledge about biological sciences, so you might know that like DNA is essentially the blueprint of life. So just as like how an architect starts with a drawing of like what he wants the building to be, life has this master plan called the information to build a human being or a living being, like a plant, an insect, an animal, anything that's living. The information to build that up, it's contained and it's stored in a molecule called DNA. And so what genetic engineering is mostly about knowing what different pieces of DNA does. So it's like it's kind of like a book. And so you're reading this book and you're trying to understand this language of life, right? So it's like all like how do you make a particular protein, how do you make a liver, how do you make a heart, and all those kind of things are encoded in this particular language of DNA, which has only four letters in the alphabet, A, T, G, C, which are four different um, chemical groups. And so essentially, what as a geneticist, what you try to do is like you try to decode this language of genes. So like, what do certain sequences of DNA do in when put in a particular body, and like how they interact with each other to give you the complex animal that animal is. And that's the basic premise of genetics, is that all the information necessary to make a living being is encoded in the DNA. And how do we understand that, how to decode that language, and then how do you use that and to our benefit and have practical applications. So genetic engineering applications could be so there's this like huge storm in the scientific community about CRISPR-Cas and like designer babies. So what that lets us do is like we have some sort of knowledge as to like what particular genes do in particular bodies. So like there's a gene that makes you more prone to diabetes, or there's a gene that makes you have like the color of your eyes is determined by your genes, and stuff like that, right? So if something is a very simple concept that like one gene affects one particular trait or characteristic, then it's easy to meddle with and tweak. So this whole CRISPR-Cas technology that's been coming up, what it lets you do is like make precise tweaks onto your DNA. So like it lets you cut and paste. So essentially, when you're working on a document, say in Word or something like that, what you're doing is like you can take pieces from different parts and like you just cut that and paste it and copy that and paste it. So CRISPR-Cas technology lets you do that with like biological molecules with DNA. So you can cut and paste DNA, and like what that lets you do is that once you know that a particular gene affects a particular function, you just cut that thing. You want that in a different organism, and you can just paste it there and like have all sorts of different things come up. So for example, people have grown human ears on mice, and so that's what genetic engineering does. Is like the technology is fairly new, so like there's a lot of challenges that come in when we talk about genetic engineering, but that's kind of like the end goal, is like making better humans, making better disease-free humans, and just like having all the different traits that we want. That's genetic engineering. Like evolutionary genetics is essentially, so this is so Darwin's theory of evolution is that it tells you how life evolves, or like how life on Earth adapts to different environmental changes, right? So like right now, global warming is a big threat, and like there's a trend towards warming climate and all sort of things. And so the theory of evolution gives you the conceptual basis to understand how different species or different organisms evolve to different changing conditions. And evolutionary genetics is basically a subset of that broader study, which looks at the mechanistic basis of like how do different organisms adapt to different environments. And how does that, like how does the genetic composition of an animal make it more or less suited for a particular environment. And so there's a multitude of questions you can ask both in both the fields of genetic engineering and evolutionary genetics. And it's mostly like you just want to know how the world works, and like why do we have so many insects, but why do we have only one species of say Homo sapiens and stuff like that, right? So those are some questions that you can answer using evolutionary genetics. I look at the interactions between the mitochondria and the nuclear genome. So your DNA in all of your bodies is like spread into two different compartments. I look at the interactions between them, and sometimes they have significant effects on health itself. So if your mitochondria doesn't function well, you can't exercise that well. You have other sort of health issues, and these kind of like understanding how mitochondria works would then eventually arm us with the knowledge to go and fix those issues and like sort of get rid of mitochondrial diseases. That's way too far in the future, but that's kind of the broad goal. Um, so that's the sort of brief overview about what genetics is, and what kind of questions you can answer with genetics. Do you guys have any more questions about what the day-to-day life looks like, and like what the work itself is? So, Samarth's question is about whether a medical degree helps in pursuing genetics. It's so I guess it comes back to the basic distinction between applied and basic sciences. So basic sciences is like you just like curious about something, right? So like you want to know how genes give you blue eyes versus black eyes versus brown eyes, and how they affect different um, traits and characteristics. Whereas medical sciences is like you basically learn about all. So basic sciences is about generating new knowledge, whereas medical science is about applying existing knowledge to solve practical human problems. If that makes a clear distinction there. So if you it depends on the sense that like if you get too deep into medical sciences, you still can pursue so like doctors do research. It's not like doctors only treat patients. Doctors also do research, but that's way too far in the future. So like to become a doctor, you have probably about 8 years of training. It's the same for a scientist too. And then eventually, once you get to that stage, once you are like a well-meaning practicing clinician, that's when you start foraging into science and research. So if research is your focus, then it just means that it takes you way longer to get to what you want if you pursue the medical fields. But if you are interested in the practical aspects, being more financially stable, or like just helping people out more in the service immediate service sector, then medical sciences is a more specialized field to get into. I hope that answers the question. Like, if you want to pursue genetics, it's essentially like if you just want to do research, just aim for a research degree, go for bachelor's of science, master's of science, and then PhD. If you if you are interested in research, but then you want to still you are attracted more by the societal aspects of the job, like helping out people and like curing diseases, stuff like that. So just helping out people in general, then go with the medical field. So have your complete your training in the medical sciences, and then once you're an established doctor, surgeon, or like anything, you could then dive into research and contribute that way. So it's nothing set in stone. Every time it's a dynamic field. You're adaptable. So no matter what stage you are in, you can always make some changes here and there to basically get what you want from the thing you're pursuing. If that answers that solves your problem or conundrum. So yes, so about Summer's question about experimenting different coding of human genes. So so again, I'll get back to the medical versus pure sciences distinction. Is that so? When you're learning about medical sciences, you're learning about like what diseases, like what are diseases, and like what different diseases are. So, say if you are like um, a a heart doctor, a cardiologist, right? So you learn about what kind of diseases affect the heart, and then what the symptoms are, and like how do you even diagnose a disease, and once you diagnose a disease confidently enough, what's the next step, and like how do you solve those problems. So that's more of your medical training. So it's more about like just being proficient in the existing knowledge, and like trying to apply that to save lives immediately. But if you're more interested in like knowing how different things work, like so essentially like what are some genes that make people more likely to develop a heart condition versus not. So those kind of things, medical sciences would be a long-winded way to get to those sort of questions. And so for that, a research degree would be the most useful directly, because then like as you're interning and as you're learning about your sciences through your like graduate degree and undergraduate degree, you get to apply that knowledge immediately, and like the kind of things you learn are a little bit different than the medical sciences. There's a lot of overlap between those, but then it just the outcome is so different that like your training is sort of a little bit different. In the medical sciences, the emphasis is more about knowing all the knowledge that's out there, and as efficiently as you can, so that you can make accurate diagnosis. Whereas in the scientific fields, or in the experimentation field, it's more about generating new ideas, and like how do you sort of like get to know more about a system. How do you break open a system and like try to understand the bits and pieces? So that's the major distinction between those. And um, yeah, as I said, like it's really important to understand to understand what your interests are and what's driving you towards a particular career. Because at the end of the day, no matter what career you choose, you're gonna have to do the grunt work, right? And like the grunt work is what is the most frustrating for most people. And if you kind of like the field you are working in, the grunt work doesn't seem as frustrating as it generally is. And so that's why the most important advice I could give you is that try to identify what excites you, what is it that you're willing to put in a lot of work in, and that has to be, it could be unpaid work or stuff like that, right? So once you have that set in, then you can like go full steam on towards that particular field, and try to put yourself out there, get as much information as you can before you actually have to make a decision. And yeah, once you have that, like stick with it, put in the grunt work, and like the grunt work's gonna pay eventually. So that's like the primary advice I can give. Are there any more questions? So about the specific questions, it just so about like what particular degree to pursue versus what particular specific colleges to go through. At the undergraduate level, there aren't many specialization courses that you can take just to be a genetic engineer. You still have to go through your basic 11th and 12th grade. Like in India, education is not about electives. It's more like you have to have a basic general knowledge, which is great because then you get to explore a lot of different avenues. And a lot of the questions that you guys are asking is basically like about specific institutions or specific degrees, and those kind of things would those the answers to those would depend on what exactly you want and what exactly your questions are. And eventually, it's like so an institute is only as good as the fit between you and an institute. Like so, an institute could be the top institute in the world, but then at the same time, if it doesn't fit or if it doesn't have the program degree program that doesn't interest you, it's useless to you, right? Like it's not going to be of much use to you, even if it's the top university in the world. And so for that, it's important to know what the top university affords you is that the opportunities to explore more. So like it's always good to go to a better university, just because of the opportunities and exposure you would get there. But that doesn't mean that just because a university is like top ranked doesn't mean that it's going to be a good fit for you. And so that's why it's important to see what particular things you are interested in. Like so, if you're interested in research more, then you should go for a more research focused undergraduate like the ISA. If you're interested in say knowing more or the industry aspect of sciences, then you should look for a field that like prepares you for that and like has prepares for colleges and that has a say a placement cell or something like that that like can jumpstart your career from there. So it depends sort of like on what exactly you want from the career, and the answer to which institute is good is different for every person. And so when I was choosing an institute for my graduate studies, so a PhD in the US is a pretty long course, pretty long degree, a long term degree. So it's like it takes about on average 5 to 6 years. And so what it means is like you essentially working on one project with one particular scientist who's guiding you towards your thesis. So it's like a pretty hefty volume that you have to do a lot of experiments and a lot of knowledge. And so you kind of like stuck with this one thing with one particular person for like at least 6 years of life. So it's a pretty important decision to make, right? And so there's different things to consider when you choose a university. And if you want to get into sciences, you'll be working very closely with the scientists that you directly interact with. So in that case, I would put more emphasis on the immediate work environment. So how good your fit with your advisor is, how good your fit with the rest of the lab is, and like the rest of the working group and stuff. Before you, that should be an important consideration when you try to choose a specific institute. Um, there's another question about participation in Olympiads, quizzes, and not yeah. So Rohan Goyal wants to. Rohan Goyal's question is about he participates in a lot of Olympiads, quizzes, and competition, but he finds it difficult to form proper connections, and like how do you basically go about networking. So this is one thing that you'd have. This is one of the issues that you'd probably have in any sort of career you go to. Like you want to do a business, you want to make those proper connections with people, and like networking is a skill that you just develop. So one good thing is just be blatant. Like don't have any reservations. Just like be it. Just you have to annoy your teachers. You have to just like keep at it. Just sometimes people are more warm, sometimes people are more cold, and depending on that, you just have to like keep at it. But then once you're at the Olympiads, like try to talk to your peers, like who are right next to you. So you form the friendships there. You have a lot of connections. You have a lot of similarities. So it's easy to form connections with your peers itself, and like your peers have their own pool of contacts, like their teachers, their mentors, and all those sort of things. And like once you start building with the most um, the group that you're most comfortable with, then you can extend on that. The other important resource would be just the judges. The judges, like they are there because they're interested in the things that you're doing, in the things that in running this whole show, right? And so they are more likely to be warm and more likely to give you the proper resources and proper feedback than say any other random person in a way. And so just um, keep asking interesting questions. Talk about ask them about their life, as in how they got there, and like people love to talk about their lives, so like that's always a good question. And yeah, you just have to sort of like find the common base, and once you have the common base with someone, just like start pitching in your ideas and like start trying to get feedback there. And once someone sees that sort of like excitement in you, and especially if they also like guiding other people, and like they like these sort of interactions, they would be more than willing to help you. So those would be a few of my like points about how do you network at different um, avenues. And yeah, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy finding a good mentor and just forming these connections. But then it's like you just keep trying, and then out of 80 tries, you might have 5 good connections. But then those 80 attempts were needed to kind of like find those 5 important connections. So just keep at it. It's okay. You're not an annoying person. Just like keep asking those questions, keep bugging people. Eventually they'll give in and they'll help you out. Does that answer your questions? And if there's anything else you would like me to elaborate on, I'd be happy to do so. All right, so I guess we're at the end of our time here. Thank you all for joining in. It was a pleasure talking to you guys and seeing where you go. Keep in touch. Let me know what your exciting projects are, and I'll be happy to see that. My email address, you can find that through the MyCaptain, the Climber website. And then if you have any particular questions in mind, I also have my number listed on the WhatsApp group. So just shoot me a question and I'll be happy to answer those. All right. See ya. Bye-bye.